Good afternoon. My name is Trinita Logue. I'm chair of the board of OFN, and it gives me great pleasure to speak to you again today. As you all know, we are a rapidly growing industry, and it's exciting to see so many new faces and so many young faces at the conference. The Gramlich Award is an opportunity to focus for a few minutes on the background and history of our industry, and on those who planted the roots of responsible finance. The Ned Gramlich Award is named for the former Federal Reserve Governor who completed his term in 2005 and was the primary liaison between the Fed Board and the Consumer Advisory Council, which is the body that advises the Board of Governors on community development and consumer affairs, consumer finance policy. He was an outspoken voice against predatory lending and a strong defender of the Community Reinvestment Act. Ned was a good friend of our industry, and he served on the OFN board from October 2006 through his death the following year. We honor his integrity and commitment each year when we give this award. Ron Phillips, President and CEO of Coastal Enterprises, is this year's honoree. Ron is unquestionably one of our leaders, and in his remarks, he will tell you about the early years of Coastal, and he will tell you a little bit about himself. So I won't take time to do that here. So many of you know Ron that you won't be surprised to hear this brief story. I asked Ron to provide me with a personal anecdote or tidbit, maybe something funny, that I could use in introducing him. What I received from Ron was a tome. Not an anecdote, an essay, a survey course, a long book chapter covering global community development finance topics, bringing together the threads of community development finance with community development into a rich tapestry of comprehensive services for low-income communities. So I hereby submit this tome as the first essay-length piece on the new CDFI Connect platform. You can read it there. And I am left with no personal anecdote, just the real thing. As an example, CEI is helping to finance a high-quality dairy enterprise involving 15 northern and down east Maine farmers called Moo Milk, Maine's own organic milk company, where, as some branding experts might explain, being put out to pasture can be a good thing. There, Ron helped me work in some humor. If you have not heard Ron speak before, get ready for an adventure, a wild ride through fish, farms, carrots, milk, and civil rights. Ron Phillips.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. Okay, that's really great. Thanks, Trinita. I've got my remarks here. If you could just paste them up on the teleprompter, I could probably get through this rather quickly. No, thank you very much. It's really a great honor to receive this award. I've got some of our staff here, and we all know that any of the work we do as a group, as a field here, it takes a team. It's a lot of heavy lifting. And so when I was called by Trinita and Mark, I was driving in the car, my cell phone, and answered the call while I was driving. And although I'm using my son's a little Hyundai, I get 38 miles a gallon on that. In Maine, we travel quite a bit. I couldn't believe that. I did ask if there was any money to it, Mark, but she shouldn't be so crass about that now. it takes a team. So I wish this group would stand. And Ellen Simon's over here, a board member. Sue Inch is the chair of our board. Just stand up and thank you, team. Thank you. Thank you all. So it's also great to be in the tradition of Ned Gramlich. In 2007, I think he died of cancer. It's a real shame and tragedy. And in 2008, in Maine, we got one of the strongest laws passed against predatory mortgage lending in the state of Maine. It drove out, as we insisted, non-bank lenders, the egregious agents of some of those national entities that wreaked havoc on low-income families, the strongest law in the nation. And then the financial markets just went down anyway, so things hopefully will come back up. But that policy work that we do, and all of us does at CEI in this field, is absolutely essential. I want to extend our thanks to Mark and OFN and the board. It's a great group, OFN, and your board, Mark. I've been on that board for 9 years, I think. It's one of the best boards to be on that I've ever been part of, and it's really a great experience. You learn a lot. Now, this is not going to be a surprise to some. I'll talk just a few minutes about myself and CEI, but our roots, as I've said in many times whenever I'm speaking, are in the civil rights movement. And just following the comments here of the award, congratulations for your work at SACA. Coming out of social justice, the civil rights era, when Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Led this fantastic movement for human rights, for equity, for economic opportunity. In my view, the African American experience that goes back 50 years, Hispanic experience, the experience of the Native Americans in this country, the experience of all of the minorities, which are really majorities in so many ways in this world, created the momentum and the vision of what I think is what guides our industry today and are the roots of our industry. Both the CDCs that originally came out of the Equal Opportunity Act of 1965, and then later on CDFIs, and any of us who are at the local level trying to create economic opportunity. It was fueled by the civil rights movement. And that's all that I personally had to hold on to when I moved to Maine with my wife, because she lives in Maine, or she, how did that work? We were in New York City, and I went to Union Theological Seminary and worked at the National Council of Churches. After that, with a group that eventually led to the founding of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, which some of you know, and credit has to be given also to faith-based groups as part of that civil rights era that have seeded and fed so much of what we're talking about. And I know Sister Corinne Floric is here. I asked her if I could bring up some of her sisters here, the stage, but couldn't get the habits ordered in time. In that experience in New York, we worked dealing with multinationals that were, in our view, harming many countries and cultures and disenfranchising many communities. And in that experience, I would always run into really community entities like ours that were trying to build alternative economies, different things that were going on from the international channels of corporations and in this country as well. So when I got to Maine, I wanted to start a CDC, and that opportunity came before me, and I never looked back. It happened. Our first investment was in a fish plant. Just to pick up on what Trinita says, I am going to say something about fish. In fact, my grandfather was a fisherman. In fact, if you really want to know, I'm a 100% Albanian from an immigrant family, and My grandfather was a fisherman off Cape Cod, and I used to go fishing a lot with him when I was very little. And it turned out, I never really thought about it, that when I got to Maine, which has a fisheries industry, I gravitated right to the coast, and wouldn't you know, our first investment, a major investment, was in a fish processing cooperative facility in Boothbay Harbor. Our goal there was to create 70 jobs, help 15 to 20 fishermen control and market their product. Our motto then was, or our understanding of value-added fishing was that no fish should leave Maine with its head on. There you go. So the investment put us on the map and on a trajectory of growth that we are today. We diversified in the early 80s. We started supporting important entrepreneurs, small businesses. Actually, Tom Chappell at Tom's of Maine, I don't know if you ever buy that toothpaste. They sold eventually their company, but still have a lot of the principles involved with it. One of our first investments. These were the assets that local communities had and enterprises. We added in childcare development, affordable housing, all in the 80s, building a platform of providing flexible capital and resources to these types of community building enterprises, all in Maine, all local, all targeted to the very fabric of community and what we all do. We evolved further, and in the early 90s, went into venture capital, so it's quite a complex organization. If you visit our website, you can see the multiple ways in which we tried to build a rural company that could respond to diversity, because in rural areas, people have 1, 2, 3 jobs. And it turned out at a place like CEI, you ended up adding 1, 2, 3, 8, 20 programs. And they all seemed to work, in fact. And so nothing kind of left us. And before you know it, we have this complex organization. In fact, one of our mottos on our T-shirts that we printed up once was, "Keep it complex." A very simple way to do that. But we kept building the program, and who are and what were the building blocks for any of us? And here's a point that I just have to credit the Ford Foundation. You know, 3 of them visited us in the early 90s after doing some work with us throughout the 80s, and they decided to take on a few of the CDCs in the country. I can't recall all of who they chose at that time, to help build them, to develop them in their capacity as local development companies. And for some reason, they picked CEI. It was in the summer, and they had stayed in an inn in Newcastle. Hope I'm not getting out of school here. And it was a Sunday morning, actually, I think. And they invited me to the veranda, the sunroom it was, and they were going to tell me whether they were going to support CEI or not. And I walked in, and they were very, what are those upstairs, downstairs, segments of the elegant, rich, with their tea cups and all that stuff, their printed flowery dresses. I mean, here I am desperate, wanting to, And they looked at me, they were very silent, and they smiled at me, which is very nice, and they said, "We're going to support you." I always remember that moment. I don't know how, but it's the story that, we were telling the story, and because of them and their sponsorship of CEI, not just in the 80s in some ways, but throughout the decade of the 90s, year upon year upon year of capital for investing and for operations, somewhat like the Goldman Sachs proposal. And Bank of America has done that too, with their facilities adding funds for reserve funds and so forth. building up our capacity as a business institution to do the work we're doing. We hit the year 2000 and exploded with the New Markets Tax Credit Program, now the largest allocatee in the nation, focused on rural America. Other groups and foundations and entities could be credited as well, and particularly OCS in Washington, a federal agency which is the residue of the war on poverty, a small office, appropriation of $30, $40 million a year, but giving you the grants for equity, for the power of equity. So I'm sure I've gone over my 10 minutes, right? Good. And so I'm going to come to an end here, and I'm going to give you I was not going to read this after this such a wonderful presentation before me. So I'm talking, as I'm talking to you, what's in my heart and what happens. There are 4 challenges, I think, in our experience, which I'd like to share with you that I think are really important about our work and which are the principles for the architecture of our field. The first is access to patient and flexible capital, including equity capital, without which there's not much, you can't go too far. We couldn't go too far. It's the foundation of our institutions. The second is to take that capital and leverage it with private capital markets. And that's, we're moving that forward. The Home Loan Bank is an example of that. The third, which I don't hear as much about, but thanks to Mark and the CARS group and so forth and so on, is how to fully engage in policy, and not just policy by way of research and studies, and not to diminish at all the work that such as Michael Schwack is doing with the Carsey Institute, which are incredible in the financial roundtables and the learning. But I mean paying for lobbyists to get things done at both the federal and state level. We also work in the state legislature. And the last, of course, is to, whatever you're doing, to have an impact and to make a difference and have scale, that we can be mainstream and not an alternative to our communities. The final thought, and this message is really directed to Mark and OFN and the board, is to really take on impact investing. You know, there are ways to do this. There's a marketplace of trillions of dollars. There are privately endowed and very rich people that want to do things. And it's possible to communicate with the right narrative with them and the right tools to get a big chunk of money into our field. You can start with the foundations, of course. They have $700 billion of assets. That chunk needs to get into our field, and they're cautious. Some of it's coming that way. But it goes further. And so we have to figure that out. And Mark, what I think about is that OFN and some of our peers and other intermediaries can be the place of what I'd like to call a great exchange, like the fish exchange in Portland. You know, excuse me, I got my speech is now falling on the floor. And so the great exchange. So that's how I'd like to leave this and share that challenge with you to take on impact investing. Thank you very much for this award.